The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Adelaide Cottage, casting long shadows across the wooden floors where 13-year-old Prince George sat cross-legged, staring at his phone screen. The headlines were everywhere, and they all seemed to mention his name. Prince George prepares for secondary school. The future king's next chapter. Royal teen faces new challenges. He scrolled past them all, feeling the familiar weight of expectation settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak he couldn't remove. Catherine noticed her eldest son's distant expression as she entered the room, carrying a steaming cup of tea. She had learned to read the subtle signs of his internal struggles over the years. The way his jaw tightened slightly when photographers gathered outside his school. The quiet moments when he would retreat to his room after particularly intense royal engagements. The questions he asked late at night about why his life had to be so different from his friends. "The car will be ready in 20 minutes, she said gently, settling beside him on the window seat. "Are you feeling nervous about today?" George looked up from his phone, his blue eyes reflecting a maturity that seemed beyond his 13 years. "Not nervous exactly," he replied, choosing his words carefully. "More like aware." "Do you know what I mean, Mum?" Catherine understood completely. At 13, George was beginning to truly comprehend the magnitude of his future role. Gone were the days when being a prince simply meant wearing smart clothes to special events and waving at crowds. Now, every decision he made, every friendship he formed, every mistake he might make would be scrutinized and analyzed by millions of people around the world. The previous year had been particularly challenging for George. He had watched his grandfather, King Charles, navigate health concerns while maintaining his royal duties with remarkable dignity. He had seen his father, William, step into greater responsibilities, often returning home exhausted from long days of engagements and meetings. And he had begun to understand that this would be his life too, eventually. "I keep thinking about what Papa said last week," George continued, leaning against his mother's shoulder. "About how being royal isn't about the privileges, but about the service. I want to understand that, really understand it, but sometimes it feels so big and overwhelming." Catherine wrapped her arm around her son, remembering her own struggles with accepting royal life. "You don't have to figure it all out right now, darling. You're still growing, still learning who you are. The most important thing is that you remain true to yourself while learning to serve others." That morning's engagement was particularly significant. George was scheduled to visit a youth center in London, his first solo public appearance at a charity event. While William would be present for support, George would be leading the visit, meeting with young people his own age who faced very different challenges than his own. As they traveled through London's streets, George pressed his face to the window, watching the city wake up around them. Street vendors were setting up their stalls, commuters hurried toward tube stations, and children in school uniforms walked with their parents. He wondered what it would be like to be one of them, to blend into the crowd without anyone taking notice. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had been born different people?" he asked his father, who was reviewing briefing notes beside him. William looked up, recognizing the weight behind his son's question. "Of course I do," he admitted. "When I was your age, I used to imagine being a footballer or a pilot, just a regular person with regular problems. But, George, I've learned something important over the years. Every person has their own unique challenges and responsibilities. Ours might be different, more public, but that doesn't make them more or less valid than anyone else's." The youth center was buzzing with activity when they arrived. George felt his stomach flutter with nervousness as he saw the small crowd of reporters and photographers gathered outside. This was different from family appearances where he could stand quietly beside his parents. Today, he would need to engage, to connect, to represent something larger than himself. Inside, he met Marcus, a 15-year-old who had started a program to teach younger children about financial literacy. George was struck by Marcus's confidence and passion as he explained how he had grown up in a single-parent household where money was always tight, and how he wanted to help other kids avoid the financial stress his family had experienced. "The thing is," Marcus said, as they sat together painting a mural with a group of younger children, Everyone thinks having problems with money is embarrassing. But if we don't talk about it, how are we going to learn? I want kids to know that understanding money isn't boring or scary. It's powerful. George found himself genuinely interested in Marcus's work. Here was someone his own age who had identified a problem and was actively working to solve it. How did you know this was what you wanted to do? George asked. Marcus paused, his paintbrush dripping blue paint. I guess I just got tired of feeling helpless. My mom worked 3 jobs when I was younger, and I could see how stressed she was about bills and rent. I started reading about money online, learning how it works, and I realized that a lot of financial problems come from just not understanding how things work. So I thought, maybe I can help other kids understand it better than I did. As the afternoon progressed, George met more young people who were making a difference in their communities. There was Aisha, who had created a support network for young carers who were looking after sick or disabled family members. She spoke about how isolating it could be to have such heavy responsibilities at a young age, and how important it was to have people who understood. Sometimes I feel like I'm missing out on being a normal teenager, Aisha confided as they walked through the center's garden. My friends are worried about exams and boys and what to wear to parties, and I'm worried about whether my little brother took his medication and if Mom remembered to eat lunch. George felt a deep connection to her words. I understand that feeling, he said quietly, about missing out on normal teenage experiences. It's hard when you feel like you have responsibilities that your friends don't have. Aisha looked at him with surprise and then understanding. I suppose your responsibilities are just different, aren't they? But heavy in their own way. It was one of the most honest conversations George had ever had with someone his own age about the challenges of his position. Not the privileges or the opportunities, but the weight of expectation and the sense of being different from his peers. Later that day, as they drove home through the London traffic, George reflected on what he had experienced. He had gone to the youth center thinking he would be the one offering support and encouragement to others. Instead, he had found young people who had taught him about resilience, purpose, and finding meaning in difficult circumstances. They're all so sure about what they want to do, he told his father. Marcus knew he wanted to help with financial education. Aisha knew she wanted to support young carers. How did they know? How did you know you wanted to be involved with mental health and homelessness? William considered the question carefully. I think it often comes from personal experience, George. Marcus understood financial stress because he lived it. Aisha understood the challenges of young carers because she was one. For me, I saw how mental health struggles affected people I cared about, and I saw how homelessness was a problem that felt solvable if enough people cared about solving it. So I need to wait until I find something that matters to me personally. Not necessarily wait, William replied, but be open to discovering what speaks to you. You're 13, George. You have time to explore, to learn, to find what ignites your passion for service. The important thing is to stay curious and compassionate. That evening, George sat in his room, writing in the journal his grandmother had given him for his birthday. She had told him that writing down his thoughts and experiences would help him process the complexities of royal life. As he wrote about his day, he found himself thinking not about the cameras or the protocol, but about the conversations he had had. He wrote about Marcus's determination to help other young people avoid the financial stress his family had experienced. He wrote about Aisha's maturity in caring for her family while still pursuing her own dreams. He wrote about his own growing understanding that being royal wasn't about being separate from or above other people, but about finding ways to connect with and serve them. As he prepared for bed, George looked out his window at the dark countryside surrounding their home. Somewhere out, there were millions of people living their lives, facing their own challenges, pursuing their own dreams. For the first time, instead of feeling overwhelmed by the responsibility of his future role, he felt curious about how he might fit into that larger human story. His mother knocked softly on his door before entering to say goodnight. "How are you feeling about today?" she asked, sitting on the edge of his bed. "Different than I expected," George replied honestly. "I thought it would be about me doing something for other people. But I feel like I learned more than I gave. Does that make sense? Catherine smiled, remembering similar revelations from her own early royal engagements. Perfect sense. The best royal work is never one-sided, darling. When you genuinely connect with people and listen to their stories, you're changed by the experience too. That's what makes the work meaningful. As George drifted off to sleep that night, he dreamed not of crowns or ceremonies, but of conversations yet to be had, of problems waiting to be understood, and of the person he was slowly becoming. The weight of his future was still there, but it felt different now. Less like a burden he had to carry alone, and more like a tool he could learn to use in service of something larger than himself. The 13-year-old prince was beginning to understand that his unique position in the world wasn't just about what he would receive or what would be expected of him, but about what he might be able to give and the connections he might be able to make. It was the beginning of a transformation that would shape not just his approach to royal duties, but his understanding of his own purpose and place in the world. 3 months had passed since George's first solo engagement, and the autumn term at his new secondary school brought challenges he hadn't anticipated. Eton College, with its ancient traditions and prestigious reputation, felt like stepping into a completely different world. While George had attended private schools before, nothing had prepared him for the intensity of academic life, the complex social dynamics, and the constant awareness that he was being watched and evaluated by both his peers and the wider world. The morning mist clung to the Thames as George walked across the school grounds, his dark blue uniform blending with those of hundreds of other boys. Yet despite wearing the same clothes and following the same routines, he couldn't escape the feeling of being fundamentally different. Conversations would pause when he entered a room, then resume with a slightly forced naturalness. Some boys tried too hard to befriend him, while others seemed determined to prove they weren't impressed by his royal status. It's like everyone has already decided who I am before they actually get to know me, George confided to his roommate, Oliver, one evening as they worked on their Latin homework. Oliver, whose father was a diplomat, had some understanding of living under public scrutiny, though nothing quite like George's experience. Maybe that's because you're still figuring out who you are yourself, Oliver suggested, not looking up from his textbook. I mean, you're 13. Most of us are still working out our identity without having the whole world watching. The observation stung because it contained truth. George had been so focused on understanding his future role and responsibilities that he sometimes felt disconnected from the ordinary process of teenage self-discovery. While his classmates were experimenting with different interests, forming and reforming friendships, and making mistakes they could learn from privately, George felt constrained by the knowledge that his actions would be scrutinized and potentially criticized on a national scale. His academic performance was strong, particularly in history and English subjects that came naturally to him. But it was during a geography lesson about climate change that something shifted. The teacher, Mr. Hartwell, was discussing the disproportionate impact of environmental degradation on young people and future generations when he made eye contact with George. Prince George, you'll likely be reigning during some of the most critical decades for environmental action. How do you think future monarchs should approach climate change? The classroom fell silent. George felt every pair of eyes on him, waiting to see how he would respond. This wasn't a casual conversation he could navigate with polite deflection. This was about his future, his reign, his responsibility to generations not yet born. I think, George began carefully, that future monarchs need to understand that they'll inherit a world shaped by the decisions being made now. Not just by governments and businesses, but by all of us. If I'm going to represent people in the future, I need to understand what kind of future we're creating for them. After class, Mr. Hartwell approached him. That was a thoughtful response, Your Highness. Have you considered getting involved with any environmental initiatives here at school? George hadn't, actually. Most of his extracurricular choices have been guided by tradition or by what his parents thought would be good preparation for his future role. The idea of choosing something based on his own emerging interests felt both exciting and slightly terrifying. What kind of initiatives? He asked. We have a sustainability committee that works on reducing the school's environmental impact. They're also planning a conference next spring where students from different schools will present projects about climate solutions. It might be an opportunity for you to engage with an issue you'll likely need to address as king, while also working with peers who share your concerns. That evening, George called his father to discuss the opportunity. William was in Scotland for a series of engagements related to his environmental work, and George could hear the enthusiasm in his voice when he described Mr. Hartwell's suggestion. "Climate change isn't going away, George," William said. "In fact, it's likely to be one of the defining challenges of your generation and your reign. Getting involved now, learning about the science and the solutions would be excellent preparation. But more importantly, do you feel personally drawn to the issue?" George considered the question. "I think so. When Mr. Hartwell was talking about the impact on future generations, I kept thinking about my own children someday, about what kind of world I'll be passing on to them. It felt personal in a way that other issues haven't yet." "That's exactly the right instinct," William replied. "Royal work is most effective when it comes from genuine personal conviction, not just duty or tradition." Joining the Sustainability Committee introduced George to a different side of school life. The students involved were passionate and knowledgeable, and they treated him as a fellow committee member rather than a future king. Sarah, a sixth form student who led the group, quickly put him to work researching renewable energy options for the school. "We need to reduce our carbon footprint by 30% over the next 5 years, she explained during his first meeting. "Solar panels, better insulation, maybe even a small wind turbine. But we also need to change behaviors, get students thinking differently about consumption and waste." George threw himself into the work with an enthusiasm that surprised him. He spent hours researching different renewable energy technologies, learning about carbon footprints and sustainable development. For the first time since starting at Eton, he felt like he was pursuing something because it genuinely interested him, not because it was expected of him. The project also brought unexpected challenges. When news of his environmental work reached the media, some critics questioned whether it was appropriate for a future king to take positions on political issues. Others argued that his involvement was just performative, designed to improve his public image rather than reflecting genuine commitment. Reading these criticisms online one evening, George felt discouraged and confused. Was he naive to think he could engage with important issues without it becoming political? Was his involvement actually helping, or was it just creating controversy? Catherine found him in his room, laptop closed, staring out the window with a frustrated expression. "Difficult day?" she asked, settling beside him. "I don't understand," George said. "I'm trying to learn about something that affects everyone. That will definitely affect my reign someday. But people are saying I'm being political or that I'm too young to have opinions about these things. What am I supposed to do? Stay silent until I'm king?" Catherine had faced similar criticisms throughout her own royal life, and she understood her son's frustration. "George, you're going to discover that almost everything you do will be criticized by someone. If you help with environmental issues, some people will say you're being political. If you don't, others will say you're not showing leadership or that you don't care about important issues. The key is to act based on your values and genuine interests, not to try to please everyone." "But how do I know if my interests are genuine or if I just think they're important because everyone says they are?" It was a surprisingly sophisticated question from a 13-year-old, and Catherine took a moment to consider her response. "I think genuine interest feels different. When you're working on something you truly care about, the work itself is energizing rather than draining. You find yourself thinking about it when you don't have to, reading about it in your spare time, wanting to understand it more deeply." George reflected on his experience with the Sustainability Committee. Despite the criticism, he had found himself genuinely excited about learning new things, about working with his classmates on practical solutions. When Sarah had explained how solar panels worked, he had gone home and spent hours researching different types of photovoltaic cells. When they had visited a wind farm as part of their research, he had been fascinated by the engineering involved and the potential for scaling up renewable energy. "I think I do care about it," he said finally. "Not because I'm supposed to, but because it feels important. like something I actually want to understand and help with. Then, you have your answer, Catherine replied. The criticism will continue, George. That's part of royal life. But if you're acting from genuine conviction rather than obligation or image management, you'll be able to weather that criticism with integrity. The autumn progressed with George throwing himself more deeply into his environmental work. The Sustainability Committee's conference project grew more ambitious, with plans to bring together students from across the UK to share innovative approaches to climate action. George found himself taking on leadership responsibilities within the group, not because of his royal status, but because of his growing knowledge and genuine enthusiasm for the work. His academic work also benefited from this newfound sense of purpose. History lessons about past monarchs who had navigated periods of significant change became more relevant and interesting. English literature classes that explored themes of responsibility and leadership resonated more deeply. Even mathematics became more engaging when he could see its applications in calculating carbon emissions or energy efficiency. But perhaps the most significant development was in his relationships with his classmates. As they worked together on environmental projects, George found that his royal identity became less central to their interactions. They saw him as someone who did thorough research, who asked good questions, and who was willing to do unglamorous tasks like data entry and organizing meetings. You know, Oliver said one evening as they walked back from a committee meeting, "I forgot you were a prince for about 2 hours today. You were just George, arguing with Sarah about whether nuclear energy should be part of our renewable strategy." It was meant as a casual comment, but it struck George as profoundly meaningful. For those 2 hours, he had been valued for his ideas and his contributions, not his title or his future role. It gave him a glimpse of what it might feel like to find his own identity within his royal destiny. The term's end brought both achievements and continued challenges. The Sustainability Committee had secured approval for solar panel installation and had organized their spring conference. George's grades were strong, and he had developed genuine friendships with several classmates. But the media attention continued, and he was beginning to understand that balancing his personal growth with his public role would be an ongoing challenge throughout his life. As he packed to return home for the Christmas holidays, George reflected on how much had changed since the beginning of term. He still felt the weight of his future responsibilities, but he also felt more confident about his ability to find meaningful work within his role. The environmental work had shown him that it was possible to engage with important issues authentically, even in the face of criticism and public scrutiny. More importantly, he was beginning to understand that becoming king didn't mean abandoning his personal interests and convictions, but rather finding ways to channel them in service of his future subjects. The 13-year-old who had felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of his destiny was slowly being replaced by a young man who was curious about how he might use his position to make a positive difference in the world. The spring of 2026 brought unexpected challenges that would test George's resilience and force him to confront aspects of royal life he had never fully understood. It began with what seemed like a simple family disagreement about his upcoming 14th birthday celebration, but quickly escalated into something much more complex about identity, tradition, and the weight of public expectation. Charlotte had been watching her older brother's transformation throughout the school year with a mixture of admiration and concern. At 11, she was old enough to understand that George was struggling with questions she hadn't yet begun to face, but young enough to still believe that family should be a refuge from the pressures of their public roles. "Why can't we just have a normal birthday party?" she asked during a family dinner where the conversation had turned to the elaborate plans being discussed for George's 14th birthday. Like with our actual friends, not people who want to meet him because he's going to be king someday. The question hung in the air, exposing a tension that had been building for months. George wanted a celebration that felt authentic to who he was becoming, not who the public expected him to be. But the palace communications team had other ideas, seeing the birthday as an opportunity to present a carefully curated image of the future king coming of age. "It's not that simple, Charlotte," William began, but George interrupted. Actually, maybe it should be that simple, he said, his voice carrying a new confidence that surprised everyone at the table. I've been thinking about this a lot, and I don't understand why my birthday has to be a public relations event. Can't it just be about celebrating another year of my life with people who actually care about me? Catherine exchanged a meaningful look with William. They had both hoped that George would develop strong personal convictions, but they hadn't fully anticipated how those convictions might sometimes conflict with traditional royal protocols. George, William said carefully, I understand your feelings, but there are certain expectations that come with your position. The public has an interest in celebrating milestones in your life, and we have a responsibility to acknowledge that interest. But what if acknowledging their interest means pretending to be someone I'm not? George replied, what if the person they want to celebrate isn't actually who I am? It was a question that cut to the heart of the royal paradox, the need to be both authentic and performative to maintain both personal integrity and public image. At 13, George was articulating something that many adult royals struggle with throughout their entire careers. The conversation continued over several days, with George becoming increasingly frustrated with what he saw as a fundamental disconnect between his emerging sense of self and the public role he was expected to perform. The environmental work at school had given him a taste of what it felt like to be valued for his genuine interests and contributions, and the contrast with the performative aspects of royal life was becoming harder to accept. The situation became more complicated when George's position on his birthday celebration was leaked to the press, probably by someone peripherally involved in the planning process. Suddenly, what had been a private family discussion became a public debate about tradition, modernization, and the expectations placed on young royals. Some commentators praised George for wanting a more authentic celebration, framing it as evidence of a refreshing approach to royal duty. Others criticized him for being selfish or out of touch, arguing that accepting public interest in royal milestones was part of the responsibility that came with his privileged position. Reading these competing interpretations of his feelings and motivations, George felt a deep frustration that would become familiar throughout his life. The way his private thoughts and struggles could be reduced to simple narratives that served other people's agendas rather than reflecting the complexity of his actual experience. They don't know anything about what I actually think, he said to Oliver during one of their evening phone calls. Maintaining friendships from school had become increasingly important to George as a way of staying connected to perspectives outside the royal bubble. That's the weird thing about being famous, Oliver replied. Everyone thinks they know you, but they only know the version of you that exists in public. They don't know about your terrible morning hair or how you still sleep with that stuffed elephant from when you were little. George laughed, grateful for Oliver's ability to puncture pretension with humor. I don't sleep with Mr. Peanuts anymore, he protested. If you say so, Oliver replied skeptically. But the point is, they see Prince George, the future king. They don't see George who gets nervous before presentations and who spent 3 hours last weekend trying to understand cryptocurrency because Sarah mentioned it during committee. The conversation helped George realize something important. The gap between his public and private selves wasn't necessarily a problem to be solved, but rather a reality to be managed. The key was ensuring that his public role remained connected to his authentic values and interests, even if it couldn't fully express the complexity of his private thoughts and feelings. This realization led to a compromise on the birthday celebration that surprised everyone. Instead of either a traditional royal birthday event or a completely private party, George proposed something different, a youth environmental summit that would happen to coincide with his birthday, bringing together young activists and innovators from across the Commonwealth to share their work on climate solutions. It's still a public event, he explained to his parents, but it's focused on something I actually care about, and it gives a platform to other young people who are doing important work. It feels more honest than pretending my birthday is important just because I was born into this family. The idea was met with initial skepticism from the palace communications team. who worried about the political implications of associating a royal birthday with environmental activism. But George had learned from his earlier experiences with criticism, and he was prepared to defend his proposal. Climate change isn't a political issue, he argued during a planning meeting that included senior palace advisors. It's a scientific reality that will affect everyone, regardless of their political beliefs. If we can't talk about scientific facts, what can we talk about? His confidence and clarity surprised the adults in the room. This wasn't the uncertain 13-year-old who had struggled with his first solo engagement. This was a young person who had found his voice and was learning to use it effectively. Catherine watched her son navigate these complex discussions with growing pride and concern. Pride in his developing maturity and conviction, but concern about the pressures he was placing on himself and the expectations he was creating for his future. "Are you sure about this path?" she asked him privately after one particularly intense planning session. Once you establish yourself as someone who takes strong positions on important issues, there's no going back to being a more traditional, neutral royal. George considered her question seriously. "Mom, I've been thinking about this for months. Traditional, neutral royalty worked in a different time, when people expected different things from their leaders. But I'm going to be king in the 21st century, maybe into the 22nd century. The problems we're facing require leadership, not just ceremonial representation. But leadership on what? You can't solve every problem, George. And if you try, you'll face criticism from every direction." "I know I can't solve every problem," George replied. "But climate change is different. It's going to define the world I inherit as king. If I can't show leadership on the most important challenge of my generation, what's the point of being king at all?" It was a remarkably mature perspective from someone who hadn't yet reached his 14th birthday, and Catherine realized that her son was already thinking strategically about how to use his position effectively rather than just how to fulfill its traditional requirements. The Youth Environmental Summit exceeded everyone's expectations. Young activists from across the Commonwealth presented innovative projects ranging from ocean plastic cleanup initiatives to sustainable agriculture programs to renewable energy innovations. George participated not as the star of the show, but as one voice among many, asking thoughtful questions and sharing insights from his own research. The highlight of the event was a panel discussion where George joined young activists from Kenya, Canada, and Australia to discuss the unique challenges facing their generation. For the first time, George found himself in a public setting where his royal status was relevant, but not central, where he was valued for his knowledge and perspectives rather than his title. "The thing about being young and caring about climate change," said Amara, a 16-year-old from Kenya who had developed a program to help farmers adapt to changing rainfall patterns, "is that adults sometimes dismiss us because we're young, but they also expect us to solve problems they created. It's like we have to prove we're serious enough to be heard, but we also have to be patient enough not to criticize them too harshly." George nodded, recognizing the parallel to his own experience. "I think that's true for any young person trying to take on serious responsibilities. People want you to be mature enough to handle important issues, but not so mature that you challenge existing approaches or ask uncomfortable questions." The conversation continued for over an hour, with the young panelists discussing everything from carbon pricing to climate justice to the role of technology in environmental solutions. For George, it was a revelation to be part of a substantive discussion where his contributions were evaluated on their merit rather than their diplomatic appropriateness. After the summit, George received messages from young people around the world who had watched the proceedings online. Many thanked him for using his platform to highlight their work, but others shared their own stories and perspectives on climate change and youth activism. For the first time, George felt like his royal position was creating connections rather than barriers. The success of the summit also shifted something in his relationship with his parents and the palace establishment. They began to see him not as a young person who needed to be protected from the complexities of royal duty, but as someone who was capable of thoughtful engagement with serious issues. "You've found your voice," William told him as they walked through Kensington Palace Gardens a few days after the summit. And more importantly, you found a way to use that voice that feels authentic to who you are. George smiled, but his expression remained thoughtful. I think I'm starting to understand something, Papa. Being king isn't about becoming someone different. It's about figuring out how to be myself in service of other people. The hard part isn't changing who I am. It's learning how to use who I am effectively. As spring turned to summer, George reflected on how much had changed in just a few months. The uncertain teenager who had struggled with his birthday plans had been replaced by someone who was beginning to see his royal destiny not as a burden to be endured, but as a tool to be wielded thoughtfully and purposefully. He still had doubts and moments of frustration, but he also had growing confidence in his ability to navigate the complexities of his position while remaining true to his values and interests. The most important realization was that authentic royal leadership wouldn't require him to suppress his personality or interests, but rather to develop them in ways that served others. His passion for environmental issues hadn't distracted from his royal preparation. It had become the foundation for a more meaningful and effective approach to his future role. As he prepared for the summer holidays, George felt excited about the future for the first time since beginning to truly understand the magnitude of his destiny. He was still 13, still learning, still making mistakes. But he was also developing the confidence and clarity that would serve him well as he continued growing into his role as future king. As summer faded into the golden hues of early autumn, George stood at the threshold of his 14th year with a sense of anticipation that would have seemed impossible just 12 months earlier. The boy who had once felt overwhelmed by the weight of his future crown now found himself looking forward to the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. But life, as he was learning, had a way of presenting unexpected tests just when confidence began to take root. The first indication that this autumn would be different came during a routine family meeting about the year's upcoming engagements. King Charles, looking healthier than he had in months, was reviewing a proposal for George to undertake his first international royal visit, representing the family at a Commonwealth Youth Leadership Conference in New Zealand. It would be a significant step, Charles explained, his voice carrying both pride and concern. Your first solo international engagement, your first speech to a major international audience, and your first time representing not just yourself, but the entire monarchy on a global stage. George felt his heart race, not with fear, but with excitement tinged with nervous energy. The environmental summit for his birthday had given him confidence in his ability to engage with serious issues and connect with young people from different backgrounds. But this would be something entirely different in scale and significance. When would this happen? George asked, already mentally preparing for the challenge. February, William replied, which gives us several months to prepare. But George, I want you to understand what this means. This isn't just about you anymore. Every word you speak, every interaction you have, will be seen as representing our family's values and the United Kingdom's relationship with the Commonwealth. Catherine watched her son's face as he processed this information. She saw determination there, but also a maturity that sometimes caught her off guard. How do you feel about it? She asked. George was quiet for a long moment, considering not just his immediate reaction, but the deeper implications. Nervous, he admitted, but also ready, I think. The work I've been doing with environmental issues, the conversations I've had with young people from other countries, it feels like preparation for something like this. King Charles smiled, recognizing something of his own journey in his grandson's response. The nervousness never fully goes away, George, but you learn to channel it into energy for the work itself. What matters most is that you remain authentic while understanding the responsibility you carry. The months of preparation that followed would transform George's understanding of what it meant to represent something larger than himself. He worked with palace advisors to understand New Zealand's history, culture, and current challenges. He studied the Commonwealth's evolution and the role of constitutional monarchy in modern democratic societies. But Most importantly, he spent time talking with young people from New Zealand and other Commonwealth countries, learning about their perspectives and priorities. These conversations revealed something that surprised the palace advisors but felt natural to George. His generation of Commonwealth youth was less interested in traditional ceremony and more focused on substantive collaboration on shared challenges like climate change, education, and economic opportunity. They don't want to hear speeches about duty and tradition, George explained during one planning session. They want to know what we're actually going to do together to solve problems that affect all of us. The monarchy's value to them isn't about history or pageantry. It's about whether we can help connect them with each other and support their work. This insight led to a fundamental shift in how the visit was planned. Instead of a series of formal ceremonies and diplomatic meetings, the program evolved into something more interactive and collaborative. George would participate in workshops, lead discussions, and spend significant time listening to and learning from his Commonwealth peers. But as the departure date approached, George faced a personal crisis that threatened to undermine his confidence and preparation. During the Christmas holidays, he overheard a private conversation between his parents about concerns that some Commonwealth leaders had expressed about his youth and the appropriateness of sending someone so young on such an important diplomatic mission. The criticism wasn't public, but it was real, and it struck at George's deepest insecurities about his readiness for royal responsibilities. That night, he called Oliver, who was spending the holidays with family in Switzerland. "What if they're right?" George asked, his voice tight with emotion. "What if I'm too young, too inexperienced? What if I say something wrong and damage relationships that took decades to build?" Oliver listened patiently as George voiced fears that had been building beneath his growing confidence. "Remember what you told me after your birthday summit?" Oliver finally said. "You said the key was being authentic while serving others. Nothing about that requires you to be perfect or to never make mistakes." "But the stakes feel so much higher now," George replied. "If I mess up a school presentation, only my classmates notice. If I mess up in New Zealand, it's international news." "True," Oliver acknowledged. "But you've also proven that you can handle pressure and that you genuinely care about doing good work. Maybe the question isn't whether you might make mistakes, but whether you're prepared to learn from them and keep growing." The conversation helped George realize that his anxiety wasn't really about his youth or inexperience, but about perfectionism. He had set impossibly high standards for himself, partly because of external pressures, but partly because of his own desire to prove worthy of his position. Catherine found him the next morning sitting in the garden, despite the January cold, staring thoughtfully at the frost-covered landscape. "Second thoughts?" she asked, settling beside him on the bench. "Not second thoughts exactly," George replied. "More like first honest thoughts about what I'm actually trying to accomplish." He explained his conversation with Oliver and his realization about perfectionism. Catherine listened without interrupting, recognizing the importance of letting him work through these thoughts himself. "I think I've been so focused on not making mistakes that I forgot the point isn't to be perfect," George continued. "The point is to connect with people and try to be helpful. If I spend the whole time worried about messing up, I won't actually be present for the opportunities to do good work." "That's a remarkably mature insight," Catherine said, "and it's one that will serve you well throughout your royal career, not just on this trip." The final weeks of preparation took on a different quality as George shifted his focus from avoiding failure to embracing authentic engagement. He stopped memorizing perfect answers to anticipated questions and instead worked on understanding the underlying issues well enough to have genuine conversations about them. He also began reaching out directly to some of the young people he would meet in New Zealand, establishing connections before his arrival that would make their in-person interactions more meaningful. These preliminary conversations revealed shared interests and concerns that transcended national boundaries, giving George confidence that he could contribute meaningfully to their discussions. The departure day arrived with unexpected media attention. George had grown accustomed to public interest in his activities, but The coverage of his first solo international trip felt different in its intensity and scope. As he walked to the aircraft that would carry him to New Zealand, followed by cameras from around the world, he felt the full weight of representing his country and family on the global stage. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, George found himself thinking about the young people he would meet over the next week and the conversations they would have about issues that mattered to all of them. The focus on authentic connection rather than perfect performance had transformed his nervous energy into genuine excitement. The flight to New Zealand provided time for final preparation and reflection. George spent hours reviewing his notes and thinking about the goals he had set for the visit. But he also found himself writing in the journal his grandmother had given him, trying to capture his thoughts and feelings before the experience began to shape them. "I'm not entirely sure what I'm doing," he wrote, "but I'm sure about why I'm doing it. I want to understand how young people across the Commonwealth see their challenges and opportunities. I want to learn about different approaches to problems we all face. And I want to represent my family and country in a way that feels honest and helpful rather than just ceremonial." As the aircraft descended toward Auckland, George looked out at the landscape below and felt a profound sense of possibility. This wasn't just his first solo international engagement. It was the beginning of what he hoped would be a lifetime of meaningful connections with people around the world who shared his commitment to making a positive difference. The 14-year-old prince who stepped off the plane in New Zealand was fundamentally different from the 13-year-old who had struggled with his first youth center visit less than a year earlier. The transformation hadn't been about becoming someone else, but about discovering how to be himself more effectively in service of others. Over the course of that week in New Zealand, George would have conversations that challenged his assumptions, experiences that broadened his perspective, and moments of connection that reinforced his growing understanding of what authentic royal leadership could look like in the 21st century. But perhaps most importantly, he would discover that his youth and relative inexperience weren't obstacles to overcome, but assets to leverage. The young people he met were energized by working with someone their own age who shared their sense of urgency about global challenges and their optimism about finding solutions. As George prepared for his first major speech to the Commonwealth Youth Conference, he felt nervous but grounded. He had learned that perfect preparation mattered less than genuine engagement, that representing his family and country didn't require suppressing his personality, and that his unique position could be a powerful tool for bringing people together around shared goals. The speech he would give the next morning wouldn't be perfect, but it would be authentic. And in that authenticity, George was beginning to understand, lay the foundation for the kind of king he wanted to become. Someone who used his position not to stand above others, but to stand with them in addressing the challenges and opportunities of their shared future. Standing at his hotel window, looking out at Auckland's harbor under the Southern Hemisphere stars, George felt ready for whatever came next. Not because he had all the answers, but because he had learned to ask better questions and to listen more carefully to the responses. The journey toward kingship was far from over, but he was finally walking the path with confidence and purpose, guided by values he had discovered and principles he was prepared to defend.